Hey everybody, we're going to be looking at the Watergate crisis. Probably one of the more interesting things about U.S. history too. One of the most interesting and disturbing aspects of U.S. history too. Looking at basically the demise of Richard Nixon's administration in his second term, shortly after getting reelected. So, in order for us to do that, it's going to be a four-part series, or four learning objectives, basically. The first two will be dealing with a lot of background information, dealing with political theory, looking at the framers of the Constitution and what they tried to construct with the U.S. Constitution. And then we'll get into the details of Watergate crisis, and then there'll be a five-part series that you want to look at concerning Watergate, a documentary on that. So the overarching essay prompt here is discuss the principles of realistic idealism and political idealism and the concerns of the framers of the Constitution. How did the concerns of the framers apply to the Watergate crisis? In your discussion, address the following: the historical context in which Watergate occurred, the background that led to the Watergate crisis, how specifically was President Nixon involved in the crisis, what crime was he specifically charged with, provide at least 3 examples how Nixon further complicated the investigation, and what ultimately led to Nixon's resignation. So you want to look at those. Those are basically 6 things of the specifics of the Watergate crisis. This prompt up here is dealing with right here is dealing with the political theory of the framers and what they tried to provide, anticipating that human beings were full of folly and and because of that, the human shortcomings needed to be addressed within a institutionalized framework. Okay, let's see if we can make sense of this. So we want to, with the learning objective 1, we want to discuss the concerns of the framers of the Constitution about political parties and the human condition. So the founding fathers and the intentions of the Constitution of 1787. What they understood was, under the American political system, there is a constant testing of strength among the 3 branches of government and between the 2 major parties. It is a form of creative tension whose remarkable vitality over the years since 1787 would have delighted but not surprised the men who wrote the Constitution. In forming the Constitution, the framers of the document tried to create a government that would discourage the formation of national parties, right? So under George Washington, there were no political parties, but that would soon change once we get to the second president, John Adams. They knew conflict between organized groups was bound to occur, as it had occurred during the drafting of the document itself. The farmers could be pitted against merchants, slaveholders could be against their non-slave holders, the rich against the poor. So there's varying interest groups within society that are going to gravitate towards people that are going to try to represent varying interests within society. Such divisions in society were bound to lead to factions or political parties, which would struggle to gain control over state and federal governments. So these struggles would bring out people's worst failings, the framers anticipated, which would struggle to gain control, which would be selfishness, ambition, deceit. In order to gain the advantage, political parties and their leaders might stop at nothing. They might mobilize their support by appeals to fear and greed. People's loyalties would be tied to their party rather than their country. And the very idea of the loyalties to the country comes into question. What does that mean exactly? It's a very ambivalent term here. No government arrangement, of course, is perfect. Change imposes a constant stress, and from time to time the pieces get out of balance. Alternatively, perhaps the balance that worked well in another day will no longer work for future generations, right? And so adjustments are made, and this is where the amendment process comes into play. The framers of the Constitution were also in agreement on the question of human nature and the exercise of political power. It was acknowledged that wealth tends to corrupt the mind, and the rich men as well as poor would use their power to their own advantage if given the opportunity. So much of the debate during the Constitutional Convention was on the degree of how much power the federal government should have. What was not under debate was that the federal government needed strong centralized power, right? So it was recognized that centralized power was needed. It was feared that this power might be misused, though, if concentrated in the hands of only a few people. The framers of the Constitution assumed from the very beginning that although power was necessary, it was very dangerous. They tried to write a constitution that would ensure effective power of the government and yet also place reliable checks and safeguards on the use of that power. In one of the greatest statements ever written on the nature of government and the need to constraints on government power, James Madison, in Federalist Papers number 10, eloquently expressed the basic philosophy that guided the formation and drafting of the Constitution. Quote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature itself that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." So he's basically laying out the case that the government is a necessary evil. It's evil because it necessitates real power over people. And in order for this thing to work, you need to make sure that that power is kept in check to oblige itself, right? That it's not going to be using power for the sake of power, but using power in order to govern people so everybody can, well, so they don't just kill each other off, right? This is the whole function of government. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. We're not, and so government is necessary to make sure everybody gets along, right? Is the theory, at least. So human nature, they believe, was universally fallible. One can only rely upon built-in institutional safeguards, in other words. Therefore, the political activities or crimes that occurred from the time of J. Edgar Hoover in the 1950s and through Watergate era should not be surprising, and in fact were anticipated by the framers of the Constitution. As for a discussion of the Watergate crisis, as it has been come to call, it is because it is a reflection of both the strengths and weaknesses of this political system, the American political system, that we're going to explore within these next couple of learning objectives here. So as we learned in our government class or civics class, because of their view of human nature, the framers of the Constitution incorporated the principles of shared power and the separation of power in order to prevent tyranny. This principle set in motion a self-adjusting mechanism under which one branch checks the excesses of another or picks up initiatives avoided by another, with the interaction of the whole generally resulting in a force for moderation. right? It slows down the ambition of one individual because they're constantly being checked by other individuals in the other branches. So an important question is raised here. Does a Republican form of government depend on the virtue of its people, or on the formal political institutions that control the people and their rulers? In other words, is it the character of the people who are in office that will determine whether a representative form of government will continue in this country, or is it the nature of the political institutions with its checks and balances and shared powers themselves that protect us from our own human nature? The framers placed their faith in the institution they created. So a big question is for us, to this very second, is where do we place our faith? Is it in specific leaders? Is it in the institution? Is it a combination of both? And this is what, in large part, the Watergate crisis forced society during this time to ask. So, in concluding this learning objective here, I want to close it out with Barbara Jordan's famous speech, which was the opening statement as a member of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, then beginning the hearings to consider whether to impeach President Richard M. Nixon on July 5th, 1974. So basically her speech is a very eloquent and instructive constitutional lecture on exactly what is impeachment. So without further ado, I'll let the great Texan U.S. representative to Congress explain exactly what was at stake and the authority of the House representatives to offer orders of impeachment.
Today I am an inquisitor, and hyperbole would not be fictional and would not overstate the solemnness that I feel right now. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. And I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. Who can so properly be the inquisitors for the nation as the representatives of the nation themselves? The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men. And that's what we're talking about. In other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. It is wrong, I suggest, it is a misreading of the Constitution for any member here to assert that for a member to vote for an article of impeachment means that that member must be convinced that the president should be removed from office. The Constitution doesn't say that. The powers relating to impeachment are an essential check in the hands of the body, the legislature, against and upon the encroachments of the executive. The division between the two branches of the legislature, the House and the Senate, assigning to the one the right to accuse and to the other the right to judge. The framers of this Constitution were very astute. They did not make the accusers and the judges the same person. We know the nature of impeachment. We've been talking about it a while now. It is chiefly designed for the president and his high ministers to somehow be called into account. It is designed to bridle the executive if he engages in excesses. It is designed as a method of national inquest into the conduct of public men. The framers confided in the Congress the power, if need be, to remove the president in order to strike a delicate balance between a president swollen with power and grown tyrannical and preservation of the independence of the executive. The nature of impeachment, a narrowly channeled exception to the separation of powers maxim. The Federal Convention of 1787 said that. It limited impeachment to high crimes and misdemeanors and discounted and opposed the term maladministration. It is to be used only for great misdemeanors, so it was said in the North Carolina Ratification Convention. And in the Virginia Ratification Convention, we do not trust our liberty to a particular branch. We need one branch to check the other. No one need be afraid. The North Carolina Ratification Convention, no one need be afraid that officers who commit oppression will pass with immunity. Prosecutions of impeachments will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community, said Hamilton in the Federalist Papers number 65. We divide into parties, more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. I do not mean political parties in that sense. The drawing of political lines goes to the motivation behind impeachment, but impeachment must proceed within the confines of the constitutional term high crime and misdemeanors. Of the impeachment process, it was Woodrow Wilson who said that nothing short of the grossest offenses against the plain law of the land will suffice to give them speed and effectiveness. Indignation so great as to overgrow party interest may secure a conviction, but nothing else can. Common sense would be revolted if we engaged upon this process for petty reasons. Congress has a lot to do. Appropriations, tax reform, health insurance, campaign finance reform, housing, environmental protection, energy sufficiency, mass transportation. Pettiness cannot be allowed to stand in the face of such overwhelming problems. So today we're not being petty. We're trying to be big, because the task we have before us is a big one.